Was Jesus a Bodhisattva? Have you ever wondered if the world's greatest spiritual teachers, separated by time, geography, and tradition, were actually speaking the same eternal truth? What if Jesus of Nazareth, walking the dusty roads of Galilee, and Siddhartha Gautama, meditating beneath the Bodhi tree in India, weren't just parallel figures in history, but kindred souls echoing a universal message? Here's something that might surprise you. Across cultures and centuries, mystics, monks, and scholars have quietly asked the same question: was Jesus, in essence, a Bodhisattva, a being so filled with compassion, so selfless in purpose, that he postponed his own liberation to help others awaken? In this video from Zen Buddhism Wisdom, we'll explore this bold, beautiful idea, not to blend religions, but to reveal the spiritual DNA they might share. We'll uncover sacred parallels, historical mysteries, and timeless truths that just might shift how you see both Jesus and the Buddha, and perhaps, how you see yourself. So stay with me until the very end. Because the deeper we go, the more you'll see, this isn't just a comparison between two enlightened beings, it's an invitation to awaken the light within you. In the grand tapestry of spiritual evolution, Jesus and the Buddha emerged not merely as figures of faith, but as luminous beacons appearing at two different points along humanity's eternal search for truth. Though they walked this earth centuries apart, Buddha amidst the forests of ancient India, Jesus beneath the olive groves of Galilee, there exists between them a resonance, like distant mountain peaks echoing the same thunder. Buddha was born into opulence but chose renunciation. Jesus was born into humility and chose sacrifice. One left behind a kingdom of gold, the other refused the temptations of power in the desert. These are not random decisions. They are deliberate rejections of the material veil that clouds the soul's vision. And yet, it is not their choices alone that fascinate, it is the inner architecture of their teachings. Strip away the cultural clothing, the chants in Pali, the parables in Aramaic, and what remains is startlingly similar, a roadmap to inner freedom, compassion, and transcendence. Consider this: in the Majjhima Nikaya, the Buddha teaches that the root of suffering is tanha, craving born from ignorance of the self. In the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus says, "What will it profit a man if he gains the whole world, but loses his own soul?" One warns of craving, the other of profit at the cost of essence. Both speak to the same spiritual peril, identification with the fleeting, while forgetting the eternal. But the harmony between their words goes beyond doctrine. It seeps into the lived reality of their paths. Buddha sat beneath the Bodhi tree, refusing to rise until he understood the nature of suffering. Jesus wandered into the wilderness, fasting 40 days, confronting the shadows of desire, pride, and fear. These are not just trials, they are sacred thresholds, where ego is dismantled and truth is revealed. And perhaps most striking of all is how both saw the divine, not as a distant ruler on a throne, but as something dwelling within. The Buddha did not deny the gods, he simply taught that liberation comes not from worshipping them, but from knowing oneself. Jesus, too, did not proclaim himself a king in the worldly sense, but said plainly, "The kingdom of God is within you." That one line alone shattered the foundations of religious hierarchy, and echoed the Buddha's insight that nirvana lies not in the heavens, but in awakened awareness. There are also tantalizing historical curiosities. Some Tibetan legends suggest that long before he began preaching, Jesus traveled east, studying with sages in India and the Himalayas. Though debated, the existence of ancient scrolls in monasteries near Ladakh, such as the so-called Life of Saint Isa, speaks to the possibility of spiritual cross-pollination. While these accounts may never be fully verified, their persistence across cultures hints at a larger narrative, that truth often flows beneath the borders of nation and creed. And what of the silence that both men cultivated? The Buddha taught vipassana, insight through silence, stillness, and breath. Jesus, too, withdrew often to lonely places to pray, to listen, to simply be. In Luke 5 verse 16, it says, "But Jesus often withdrew to lonely places and prayed." This is not escape, it is return. Return to source. return to truth, even their use of storytelling bears resemblance. Jesus spoke in parables, the Buddha in sutras, both using metaphor as a means to pierce through the limits of logic. They knew that ultimate reality is not taught, but tasted. That truth is not a system, it is an experience. So we must ask ourselves, were these two awakened beings delivering separate messages? Or were they tuning into the same eternal frequency, one that exists beyond scripture, beyond religion, beyond even time itself? Perhaps they were not founders of opposing traditions, but reflections of the same sacred archetype, the teacher, the healer, the revealer of the inner path, not two lights competing in the night sky, but twin flames burning in different lands, showing us that wisdom is not bound by chronology or geography. It speaks, always, from the heart of silence, and it speaks the same truth to those willing to listen. To grasp the soul of this mystery, we must look beyond definitions and into the living essence of the Bodhisattva ideal. In the heart of Mahayana Buddhism, the Bodhisattva is not merely an enlightened being. They are the embodiment of the ultimate paradox, one who has reached the mountaintop of liberation, only to descend once more, not for themselves, but for the sake of every struggling soul still caught in the valley of illusion. They renounce final bliss, not out of obligation, but out of boundless love. This is not just compassion, it is radical compassion. The kind that does not flinch in the face of suffering, the kind that sees another's pain as indistinguishable from one's own. The Bodhisattva's vow is not poetic, it is cosmic. It is the solemn promise whispered across lifetimes, until every tear has dried, until every cry has been answered, I will not rest. I will return again and again, through the fires of birth and death, until not a single soul remains in darkness. In ancient Buddhist texts, bodhisattvas such as Avalokiteshvara, the Lord of Compassion, are said to have postponed their own final liberation countless times. One story tells how Avalokiteshvara, overwhelmed by the suffering of the world, shattered into 1,000 pieces, only to be reassembled by divine grace, with 1,000 arms and 1,000 eyes, to see and touch every pain at once. Now shift your gaze to Jesus, not as a religious symbol, but as a living embodiment of that same archetype. He walked among those society had abandoned, lepers, widows, tax collectors, adulterers. He didn't preach from ivory towers or sit upon jeweled thrones. He knelt in the dust. He wept at the tomb of Lazarus. He held children in his arms. He forgave even those who nailed him to the cross. His every act was a surrender of self. His every miracle, a gesture of mercy. When others demanded vengeance, he offered peace. When others reached for power, he washed their feet, and when the moment came to choose safety or sacrifice, he chose the cross, not for glory, but to bear the weight of the world's wounds. This is not just heroism. This is the Bodhisattva spirit, alive, breathing, embodied in human form. The Greek word agape, used in the Gospels, denotes a love that expects nothing in return. It is unconditional, infinite, self-emptying. In Buddhism, the equivalent is karu, compassion without limits, compassion that does not choose who deserves it. Now consider this, in the Bodhisattva's path. Enlightenment is never a personal escape. It is a collective awakening. Likewise, for Jesus, salvation was never about isolating the worthy, it was about redeeming even the lost, the broken, the forgotten. It is not the healthy who need a doctor, he said, but the sick. And history, too, records echoes of this shared vow, in the lives of mystics like Francis of Assisi, who gave up everything to live among the poor, or Tibetan saints like Milarepa, who transformed a life of hatred into one of light. We see the ripple of that same sacred pattern. The truly awakened do not ascend alone, they reach back with open arms. The Bodhisattva ideal shatters the illusion of separation. It declares that your suffering is my suffering, and therefore your liberation must become my purpose. Jesus lived this truth in flesh and blood. He bore the sins of many, not as punishment, but as participation. He did not run from the agony of the world, he drank from its cup. So when we ask, was Jesus a Bodhisattva? The question is not whether he knew the term, but whether he lived the truth it represents, and in every way that matters, he did. The births of Jesus and the Buddha are wrapped in myth, mystery, and meaning, stories not merely meant to impress the mind, but to stir the soul. In the Christian tradition, the birth of Jesus is painted in celestial hues. A virgin conceives without worldly touch, a star pierces the night sky like a divine beacon, and kings from the east kneel before a newborn wrapped in humility. The heavens open, and angels declare, peace on earth. This is not just a tale of origins, it is a declaration of sacred intention. Jesus enters the world not in a palace, but in a manger, teaching us that divinity often arrives in silence, far from the thrones of power. In Buddhist lore, the story is equally profound. Queen Maya, in a dream more vivid than waking life, sees a white elephant descend from the heavens and enter her womb, a symbol of purity, wisdom, and the royal path of awakening. When Siddhartha is born, legend says he stands and takes 7 steps, lotuses blooming beneath his feet, as he proclaims, "This is my last birth. I have come to liberate all beings." Do these stories defy logic? Perhaps. But their truth lies deeper than fact. They speak the language of sacred myth, where symbolism becomes the bridge between the seen and the unseen. Across cultures and centuries, humanity has often marked the arrival of world teachers with celestial signs. When Confucius was born, ancient Chinese sages wrote of strange constellations appearing in the sky. The same is said of Krishna in India, whose birth was foretold by sages and resisted by tyrants. These stories do not compete with each other, they sing in harmony, each voice carrying a verse in the universal song of spiritual awakening. And once born, both Jesus and the Buddha followed a hauntingly similar rhythm. Siddhartha Gautama was raised amid luxury, cocooned from the world suffering behind palace walls. He had everything: pleasure, power, promise. Yet the sight of sickness, old age, and death shattered the illusion. He could no longer accept comfort while others lived in chains. So he renounced it all: wealth, family, identity, and stepped into the wilderness, seeking truth beyond the veil. Jesus, too, grew up in warmth and simplicity, the son of a humble carpenter. Yet something within him burned brighter than the fires of routine life. At around the age of 30, he left behind the ordinary to walk the lonely path of the extraordinary. He wandered the deserts. He fasted for 40 days. He faced temptation not with weapons, but with wisdom, each left behind familiarity not out of rebellion, but out of reverence, for something higher, deeper, eternal. The Buddha sat beneath the Bodhi tree, not just in search of answers, but to confront the very machinery of suffering. Jesus climbed the mount, not merely to speak, but to awaken hearts with truths that echoed beyond time. Blessed are the peacemakers. Love your enemies. The meek shall inherit the earth. Both men became revolutionaries of the spirit, not with swords, but with silence, not with conquest, but with compassion, and in their departure from worldly attachments, they each demonstrated an essential spiritual principle, that destiny is not fulfilled through comfort, but through courageous surrender. They walked different roads, under different skies, in different tongues, yet each became a lighthouse in a storm-tossed world, a reminder that great souls do not arrive to be worshipped from afar. They come to remind us of the sacred spark within ourselves. They come to awaken. In the vast symphony of spiritual teachings, love emerges as the purest, most universal note, a sound that both the Buddha and Jesus played with unmatched clarity. But this was no sentimental love. It was not the kind sung in lullabies or whispered in fleeting romance. This was love as a path. Love as liberation. Love as the highest expression of spiritual maturity. The Buddha called it metta, loving kindness that knows no boundary. Not an emotion, but a cultivated state of mind, radiating compassion without expecting anything in return. The practice of metta begins quietly, internally, like a candle lit in a cave. But as it grows, it illuminates not only our own hearts, but also the darkest corners of the world. Jesus called it agape, divine, selfless love. A force so powerful it could wash away sin, dissolve anger, and resurrect hope from tombs of despair. He spoke of a love that embraced enemies, that turned the other cheek, that gave not because it was owed, but because it overflowed, while others built walls of judgment. Both Jesus and the Buddha tore them down with the power of compassion. Let's dive deeper into how they lived this love, not in parables, but in flesh and action. The Buddha once encountered a man named Angulimala, a feared murderer who had killed dozens and wore their fingers strung like a necklace around his neck. When Angulimala charged at the Buddha with intent to kill, something miraculous happened. The Buddha stood still, radiating peace, and said, "I have stopped, Angulimala. Have you?" In that moment, the killer was transformed, not by punishment, not by force, but by the stillness of unconditional love. He dropped his weapon and became a monk. Now turn to Jesus, who on the cross, nailed, bleeding, abandoned, looked down at his executioners and said, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." Even in agony, love was his final breath. Not revenge. Not blame. Just grace. Both moments are lightning bolts in human history, reminders that love, when purified of self-interest, becomes the most radical force of transformation. And while their methods differed, Buddha through insight and meditation, Jesus through parables and miracles, their hearts beat to the same rhythm. Both saw the ego not as an identity, but as a shadow that blinds us from our true nature. They knew that when we dissolve the illusion of separateness, what remains is love. This is not abstract theory. It is seen in action again and again. In early Buddhist texts, there's a story of the Buddha stopping a war. Two tribes were ready to slaughter each other over irrigation rights to a river. As tension built, the Buddha stood between the armies and asked, "What is more precious, water, or the blood of your brothers?" The armies laid down their weapons. Similarly, Jesus once prevented a woman from being stoned to death by a self-righteous crowd. He did not argue law or dogma. He simply said, "Let he who is without sin cast the first stone." One by one, the stones dropped. Not through debate. Through conscience awakened by love. These aren't just stories. They are spiritual technologies, reminders that love can disarm violence, expose hypocrisy, and heal wounds buried deep in the human soul. And love, in their teachings, is not something we give only to those who deserve it. It is a practice that breaks the cycle of karma and transcends judgment. It is how the divine breathes through us. In truth, the Buddha and Jesus did not ask us to worship them. They asked us to become like them, to become vessels of compassion in a world that so often forgets how to feel. Their lives were invitations to walk the hardest path, and the holiest, the path where love is not the reward, but the very way forward. To walk the path of truth often means walking alone, against the tide of tradition, against the current of comfort. Both Jesus and the Buddha did just that. They were not mere reformers of religion, they were spiritual revolutionaries who shattered the old molds to reveal something timeless beneath. Jesus didn't just challenge the Pharisees, he exposed the hypocrisy of those who hid behind robes and rituals while their hearts were starved of mercy. In an age where holiness was measured by outward performance, Jesus turned the lens inward. "Woe to you," he said, "you clean the outside of the cup, but inside you are full of greed and self-indulgence." This was not rebellion for its own sake, it was a call to awaken. To move from performance to presence. From appearance to authenticity. And when he healed on the Sabbath, breaking a sacred rule of rest, it wasn't to mock tradition, but to remind people that compassion does not take a day off. That law without love is just another form of bondage. He redefined the temple, not as a place built by hands, but as the heart of a human being filled with the Spirit. Likewise, the Buddha stepped beyond the walls of ancient Indian orthodoxy. Born into the Kshatriya caste, he was expected to rule, to conquer. But he renounced power and privilege to sit under a tree and conquer the self. In a society where a person's worth was dictated by birth, the Buddha declared, "Not by birth is one noble, but by deeds." This was seismic. To say that a low-caste servant or an untouchable could attain enlightenment was to overturn the very pillars of the social order. He dismantled the monopoly of the Brahmins, those who claimed to be the exclusive gatekeepers of divine truth. The Buddha taught that no priest, no scripture, no bloodline could substitute for direct experience. Be a lamp unto yourselves, he urged. Truth, he said, is not inherited. It is realized, and let's not forget, the Buddha welcomed women into his monastic order at a time when most considered them spiritually inferior. Jesus too defied patriarchal norms. He spoke with women publicly, entrusted them with his deepest revelations, and after his resurrection, it was a woman, Mary Magdalene, who was the first witness and bearer of his message. These were not just acts of kindness, they were deliberate acts of disruption. But here lies the most beautiful paradox: though both were considered threats by the systems they challenged, they never wielded power in the worldly sense. No armies. No thrones. No political platforms. Their revolution was of the heart. They didn't tear down temples, they rebuilt the soul. They didn't burn books, they burned away illusion, and perhaps most importantly, they didn't demand followers. They invited seekers. In doing so, they became dangerous, not because they incited violence, but because they inspired inner freedom. And the most dangerous thing to any corrupt structure is a human being who can no longer be manipulated by fear. They didn't just reject tradition. They redefined what it meant to be truly human. Suffering. It is the thread that weaves through every human story, every sacred scripture, every honest prayer in the dark. But what makes the stories of Jesus and the Buddha so astonishing is not merely that they acknowledged suffering, it's how they transformed it. The Buddha, after years of indulgence and then asceticism, came to a radical truth beneath the Bodhi tree, that suffering, dukkha, is not punishment, nor is it proof of failure. It is the natural consequence of clinging to desires, to identities, to illusions of permanence. But liberation is possible. Not by escaping pain, but by seeing through its illusion. By loosening the grip. The first noble truth is not a sentence, it's a mirror. And the Buddha asked us to look into it without fear. Jesus, too, gazed unflinchingly into the heart of suffering. He didn't preach a gospel of avoidance. He spoke of carrying the cross, not as a burden to lament, but as a path to rebirth. Unless a grain of wheat falls to the ground and dies, it remains alone. But if it dies, it produces much fruit. In his view, death was not the enemy. The real enemy was the unwillingness to let the ego die, and when we look closely, we see something deeper. Neither teacher romanticized suffering. They didn't ask us to seek it, but to meet it with open eyes and open hearts. In ancient Buddhist texts, there is a story of the Buddha in a previous life as a prince who encounters a starving tigress and her cubs. Moved by compassion, he offers his own body to feed her. It is not martyrdom, it is the Bodhisattva path, the realization that one's own form is impermanent, but love is not. Does that not echo Jesus in Gethsemane, sweating blood, knowing the agony that awaited him, and yet whispering, "Not my will, but yours be done"? There's a powerful symmetry here. Two awakened beings, facing the terror of physical pain, not with resistance, but with transcendence. Not for self-glory, but so others might awaken. Their sacrifices were not acts of defeat, but demonstrations of the deepest freedom, the ability to choose compassion over fear. In Buddhist thought, suffering is the gateway to wisdom. The crack through which light enters. In Christian mysticism, the cross is not just wood, it is the axis mundi, the meeting point of heaven and earth, suffering and redemption. Time and eternity, and perhaps the greatest teaching from both lives is this, that to suffer consciously is to become a vessel for love. That wounds, when embraced, can become wombs, places from which new life is born. So when the Buddha touches the earth in the moment of his enlightenment, and when Jesus stretches his arms wide upon the cross, they are not just enduring pain. They are transmuting it. Turning anguish into awakening. Suffering into sacredness. To the literal mind, the resurrection of Jesus is a supernatural event, his body rising from the tomb, defeating death in a moment of divine power. But the mystic sees something more. Something not limited to flesh and bone. What if the tomb is not just a cave in Jerusalem, but the inner chamber of the ego, the darkness we each must enter alone? And what if rising from it isn't just about walking out into the daylight, but awakening into a new state of being where fear, separation, and mortality lose their grip? In Buddhist tradition, the enlightenment of Siddhartha Gautama under the Bodhi tree was not a resurrection of the body, but a resurrection of perception. The veils fell away. The illusion of self shattered. And what remained was boundless awareness, pure, deathless, formless. This, too, was a kind of rising. Not upward, but inward. A return not to life as we know it, but to the source from which all life flows. Jesus appeared to Mary Magdalene and his disciples after the resurrection, not to prove power over death, but to show that love cannot be buried. That presence transcends the physical. His wounds were still visible, he had not erased his suffering, but transformed it. Made it radiant. Is that not the same with the Buddha? He did not erase desire, or fear, or sorrow, he saw through them. He taught not escape, but awakening, and maybe that's the heart of both messages, that salvation is not a one-time event. It is an inner realization that changes the way we walk, speak, breathe, and love. In early Christian mysticism, the second birth wasn't about going to heaven, it was about becoming fully alive. St. Paul wrote, "It is no longer I who live, but Christ lives in me." This isn't theological, it's transformational. The small self dissolves, and something vaster, timeless, takes its place. In Mahayana Buddhism, a similar shift occurs when one sees their Buddha nature. The notion of I fades like mist, and what remains is not empty, but full of compassion, clarity, and peace. So perhaps we're not meant to choose between the resurrection and nirvana. Perhaps they are twin doorways to the same sacred space, a place within us that has never been born and can never die. The Christian Desert Fathers spoke of the death before death, a shedding of the false self. The Buddha spoke of crossing to the other shore, not geographically, but psychospiritually. Both speak of death, not as an end, but as a beginning, and in both traditions, the ultimate miracle is not walking on water or bending the laws of nature, but realizing the divine essence that has always lived within. That is the meaning that transcends language, culture, and time, that you, too, can rise. That you, too, can awaken. Imagine for a moment, what your life would look like if you saw yourself not just as a seeker of truth, but as a vessel of it. What if the compassion of the Bodhisattva, and the unconditional love of Christ, were not just ancient ideals, but living possibilities within you? Because maybe this isn't just about Jesus or the Buddha, maybe this is about all of us, awakening to who we truly are beneath the noise of the world, beings capable of boundless love, radical forgiveness, fearless service. And now is the time to walk that path, not someday. Not when you've read more books or meditated longer, now. So today, choose one small act of awakened compassion. It could be offering a kind word to someone who feels invisible, or sitting in silence and simply breathing with presence, or maybe, forgiving yourself for something you've carried too long. Whatever it is, start now. Let your life become the teaching, and join us here, at Zen Buddhism Wisdom, as we build a community of open hearts, curious minds, and courageous spirits. If this message resonates with you, like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. Tell us, what does being a Bodhisattva mean to you? In the next part of our journey, we'll explore how Jesus' life mirrors the 6 perfections of the Bodhisattva path. We'll dive deeper into his teachings on mindfulness, generosity, and wisdom, showing you how these ancient practices can transform your everyday life. Let's keep this dialogue alive. Let's keep asking the big questions. Let's keep choosing love over fear, wisdom over dogma, and presence over performance, because awakening isn't for the chosen few, it's the birthright of all, and your journey starts now.